So, now to the topic of spirit and spirits. I wonder what you made of Jung Hyun-kyung's presentation at Canberra, which certainly caused very diverse reactions. We talked about spirit before. What about spirits plural? Well, of course, spirits plural are referred to in the Bible, as well as in other traditions, because most of the peoples of the world have or have had some sort of understanding of a spirit world, an animated world filled with many spirits. And in the New Testament, they are known as spirits. If they're known as spirits, that's often understood to be evil spirits. They're also referred to as demons, rulers, authorities, cosmic powers, spiritual forces, the principalities of the book of Ephesians. But on the other hand, angels are referred to as ministering spirits, and spirits are messengers. So the term spirit can be both but not only negative but also positive in the biblical record, and similarly in the spirit world of many other traditions. The New Testament also refers to the human spirit and to the spirits of the dead, or the ancestors as they would be referred to in many parts of the world. The background from which Jung Hyun-kyung was working was one of shamanism in the Korean context. Messiah Eliade described shamanism as techniques of ecstasy. This is a tradition that comes from Siberia, of frenetic dancing, the shaman going into a trance, doing all sorts of superhuman things. It was marginalized as a religious practice by the so-called world religions, by Christianity, by Buddhism, by Confucianism. But it is still practiced in the Korean context as an encounter with the spirit world and a way of solving problems in people's ordinary lives by dealing with the spiritual forces that are perceived to be behind them. It's also a way of bringing blessing and from the spirits instead of bad luck. So the shaman appeases, cajoles, and even threatens the spirits until they do what is perceived to be needed in the situation, or until the problem can be solved. There was a lot of confusion at the Canberra Assembly about the meaning of the word spirit, because many Christians had not ever used the word in the plural, especially European Christians following the Enlightenment. The theme, "Come, Holy Spirit," singular, renew the whole creation, was chosen by the Orthodox. And we saw this contrast, though, between the two opening plenary presentations, with Parthenios beginning his presentation with the Trinity, emphasizing the constitutive work of the Holy Spirit in the Church, and concluding with some ethical exhortations. Whereas Jung Hyun-kyung was emphasizing what the Holy Spirit does in God's creation to bring about justice, she hardly mentioned Christ and made no mention of the Trinity. So Jung's presentation provoked strong protest from Orthodox members and also from evangelicals who were there as part of the assembly in Canberra. The Orthodox, who are full members of the World Council of Churches, complained that the Holy Spirit is not to be confused with other spirits and must be understood in light of the doctrine of the Trinity. So they really didn't have any truck with Jung's presentation. Evangelicals were most concerned about needing a high Christology, and the reference that Jung made to Jesus, our brother, without talking about Christ as Lord in any way, was not satisfying to evangelicals, and they were very worried that this was going down some kind of syncretistic route, mixing shamanism with Christianity. So the debate caused all sorts of confusion in the different Christian traditions that were represented there. It revealed that the word spirit is not specific to Christianity, and as with God, a local equivalent needs to be found to translate the word spirit. And it raised important questions about what we mean by the Holy Spirit. If we're talking about a world of many spirits, is the Holy Spirit a spirit in the same way, or is the Holy Spirit something completely different? So Jung's presentation raised a lot of questions about the Spirit and the spirits. What's meant by spirit? If the Holy Spirit is the giver of life, why is pneumatology so often restricted to matters of the human heart and mind, to a kind of personal spirituality? If the Holy Spirit is the co-creator with God, why is the word spirit so often opposed to matter? We think of the spiritual world as something that's separate from the material world, or many Christians have done that. Is the Christian spirit different from other entities called spirit? Who has the right to discern the spirit? Jung Hyun-kyung was asserting that she, as a Korean woman, a marginalized person, could actually discern the spirit more truly than the leaders of the institutional church. And the question of how do we discern the Holy Spirit in a world of many spirits? Well, it was starting with these questions arising from the Canberra Assembly that I did my own doctoral work, and later some postdoctoral work, which resulted in this book published by Orbis in 2007, The Holy Spirit in the World, A Global Conversation. So I pointed out that the way we translate the word spirit affects how Holy Spirit is understood in any particular context, and therefore the kind of pneumatology that Christians come out with in different situations. I also suggested that Asian Christians have a richer understanding of spirit than in the West, and that we might actually learn from Asia more about how to do pneumatology, or Christians in the West might learn from Asian Christians more about pneumatology. So I looked at Indian Christian pneumatology and Korean Christian pneumatology, and these are some of the things that I discovered. So for Indian Christian theologies, I looked at three theologians that I'll introduce one by one to talk about where they're coming from when they do pneumatology. So Stanley Samata, as you see here, was the first director of the dialogue subunit of the World Council of Churches. He was a leader in interfaith relations in India, and brought religious leaders together at the highest levels for dialogue on social as well as theological issues. And he developed a pneumatology of dialogue. Pneumatology was the key foundation for dialogue as far as he was concerned. And that his understanding of the spirit in the Indian context was that the spirit should be understood as the Atman, or the self, as described by Hindus of the Advaitic or non-dualist tradition. So in that tradition, the Atman, or the self, is united with the universal spirit, and just as Jesus at his baptism realized his oneness to the Father, that realization is also there in the Hindu tradition, he argued. And so he pointed to verses like John 3:16, John 3:8, sorry, to where the Holy Spirit blows wherever the Holy Spirit wills, can't be limited to the church or even to Christianity. And also John 16:13, where we're told that the Holy Spirit leads into all truth. And he said, well, that's the truth of other faiths as well. And so this is a common platform on which we can do dialogue. Vandana was the first leader of her Catholic religious order in India. She was founder of a Hindu Christian ashram. An ashram is a Hindu form of religious community where the disciples gather around the guru. And so she coordinated this network of believers of different faith who had demonstrated their common religious experience. They felt that they shared a spirituality, and they could pray together in public for the reconciliation of different faiths in some of the crises that were happening in India. And she talked about spirituality, about a spirituality focused on the Spirit of God. And she understood the Spirit primarily as love in the Bhakti tradition of India, or the devotional tradition, where people show their love for their own personal God. And she looked particularly at John 4:23, where the discussion of the woman of Samaria with Jesus, and Jesus says that neither here nor on that mountain nor on the other mountain will we worship, but we'll all worship in spirit and in truth. The third person was Samuel Ryan, a leading Jesuit theologian in India, who had campaigned for the rights of the lower and outcast peoples of India and challenged systems of oppression that were supported by Hindu leaders. So he talked about a pneumatology of liberation, how the Holy Spirit was going to set people free from their suffering and from their bonds. And so when he looked at Indian tradition, he didn't choose the elite tradition of Atman or the popular devotional tradition of Bhakti. He instead looked at the Spirit as the cosmic power of Shakti. And Shakti is the disruptive spirit that overturns and challenges some of the norms, even the violent in some cases. And he used Luke chapter 4, the verses where Jesus preaches at his sermon in Nazareth, and pointed out that Jesus begins by saying, "The Holy Spirit has anointed me," because the Holy Spirit has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. And so this message of liberation, of good news to the poor, is a Spirit-inspired message. And the Holy Spirit works from below to change the world rather than to reinforce the traditions. So the three of them disagreed among themselves within the Indian context, but they all in different ways brought their pneumatology to bear in the public sphere. And they weren't sure whether the primary sign of the Holy Spirit in India should be dialogue, contemplative life, or socio-economic liberation. But as heirs of Hindu spirituality, they had no doubt that about the presence and activity of the one Spirit in Indian life. So moving to the Korean context, I looked at different Korean theologians, So Nam-dong, Yu Dong-sik, and Cho Young-gi, and of course Jung Hyun-kyung. The first, So Nam-dong, was one of the founders of Minjung theology, a Korean liberation theology, and he was also a political activist who went to prison for standing up against the military-backed government. because he dared to voice his commitment to the Spirit of Christ as the spirit of human freedom. So he developed a pneumatology, he would say, of the Minjung, not for the Minjung, but of the Minjung, understanding the spirit as Ki, which is in Korean, and as Chi in Chinese, is the life force or the life principle, the energy of the universe, if you like. And he derived this from Genesis 1, verse 2, where the wind of the Spirit moves over the waters. Yu Dong-sik was a leading theologian of Korean culture and religion. Through his teaching and writing, he tried to make peace between different Christian churches, between communist and capitalist, on the basis that the true Spirit of God is captive to neither of those, but brings out the best of both. So he promoted a pneumatology of national reconciliation. And he did this by translating the Spirit as Ol, and Ol is the primordial soul of the people in Korean tradition. So this was the Spirit from within the people themselves, who should be understood as the outworking of the Holy Spirit. And he looked at, he came to that conclusion because he began with Genesis 2 verse 7, where God breathes his Holy Spirit into the people, or into the first person. Jo Yong-gi is well known as the founding pastor of Yeouido Full Gospel Church, a Pentecostal church in Korea, and one of the largest congregations in the world. He began his ministry by working with the displaced and the destitute in Seoul after the Korean War. And he had an optimistic belief in the power of the Holy Spirit over the material realm, to change people's lives and to bring about blessing and to lift people out of poverty. And from this, he developed his full gospel theology, or his full gospel pneumatology. And he understood the Holy Spirit as Shin. Shin is a general Korean word for God or for spirit, but can refer to the supreme God or the great spirit out of all the spirits. So when he talked about the Holy Spirit, he was talking about the great Shin, Daeshin. He derived his pneumatology primarily from Acts chapter 2, from the story of Pentecost and how the Holy Spirit was poured out with power, and from the book of Matthew, where the Spirit overcomes the other spirits. Jung Hyun-kyung we've already looked at, and what she felt she was doing in her presentation at Canberra was challenging the patriarchal traditions and the rampant capitalism of the South Korean church and society, with women's beliefs in the need for social healing. And so her pneumatology of shamanistic healing, or of spirit and spirits, drew on the Korean tradition of the Guishin, or the ghosts. And she was using Romans chapter 8, where we hear about the groaning of the creation, and that she would think of the groaning of the spirits who've been oppressed by various means, as you read in her presentation, and how the Holy Spirit brings about their liberation and sets them to be free to be at peace and no longer bother the living. So Korean theologians were active in challenging the militaristic spirit of successive governments and the exploitative spirit of capitalism. Again, the four theologians don't agree on what is the primary concern of the spirit, depending on what aspect of Korean tradition they associate the spirit with, whether it's justice or peace or personal well-being or cosmic healing. but they share a characteristically Korean perspective that the Spirit of God is to be discerned among many spirits, many movements, many powers and authorities. So that meant that when I compared the Indian and Korean pneumatologies, I noticed that in India, pneumatology was primarily unitive. There was only one spirit that is universal. The word for spirit doesn't need qualifying with the word holy. You can just refer to the spirit, or even just spirit, that pervades everything. Whereas in Korea, the predominant form of pneumatology is plural. There are many spirits, so it's important to distinguish the spirit known by Christians from the other spirits. And to do that, of course, we use the word Holy Spirit. Interestingly, not Great Spirit, as in Joyong-i, not the spirit that's more powerful, but the spirit that is holy, that sanctifies us, that sets us apart. And so the spirit is not primarily the most powerful in a spirit world, but a qualitatively different spirit. Nevertheless, still associated with the same word, spirit. And in the book, I talked about how the spirit is present and active in the whole creation, but that unlike forms of Hindu philosophy, the world is not an emanation of the spirit, if we think in Christian terms. You need discernment to recognize the work of the spirit in any given situation, or to distinguish the Holy Spirit from all the other spirits who are out there. So then I turned to my own culture, to Western culture, and thought about, well, what do we mean by the word spirit? And I found several different illustrations. This is spirit, the free stallion, the kind of free spirit sort of idea. In the Spirit is the definitive guide to cocktails. Remember at Pentecost, they accused the disciples of being drunk. The green spirit, the spirit in creation or in ecology, or the spirits. Whispering spirits, the psychic meaning of spirit, spiritualism. The spirits of the internet, the cyberspace, the virtual world. And I had an interesting discussion with two people who are now my colleagues here at Fuller, Dr. Veli-Matti Kekkainen and Dr. Amos Young, about this wider meaning of spirit, and we came up with this book. And in the introduction, Amos Young says, any talk about spirits historically and even today has evoked fascination, fear, or incredulity, sometimes simultaneously, among other reactions. Part of the question has always been, what is being meant by spirits? What kind of realities are being referred to? The historical and contemporary semantic range of the word spirit itself begs for elucidation and clarification whenever it is mentioned. And in the conclusion, I wrote, awareness of a wider pneumatological understanding of life, the universe, and human society necessarily leads Christian theologians to a deep interest in and enrichment of the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, since this is framed in the same language of spirit. In this book, we've taken a risk of loosing spirits that for many Christians should remain bound. Scientific and socio-cultural shifts encourage us to think again about a plural pneumatology as the framework for understanding the biblical testimony to the Holy Spirit. After several centuries during which such a worldview, that is a many-spirit view, has been dismissed, interdisciplinary and religio-cultural discourses have allowed us to reimagine a spirit-filled world. Recasting Christian theology within it is an ongoing task for ecumenical learning, interdisciplinary discussion, and global conversation. So then in my own work, I've talked about the Holy Spirit among many spirits. The spirit world, or the world of many spirits, is the matrix for the development of theology in the New Testament. And in one way of understanding the confession of the New Testament writers is that the Spirit of God is the Spirit of Jesus Christ. When we talk about the Spirit of Christ, we're talking about the same Spirit as the Spirit of God. That is a way of saying that Jesus is Lord. What others know as the Spirit of life, the Spirit of truth, goodness, and love, is the Spirit Christians know as the Holy Spirit, and we recognize as embodied in Jesus Christ. So then Jesus Christ is the Christian criterion for discerning the Spirit, for discerning what is life-giving, true, good, loving, and so on.